The void of the dead reach does not whistle or howl as the poets of Terra once dreamed. It hums with the static of dying stars and the rhythmic thrum of the iron anvils failing oxygen scrubbers. I was deep in the bowels of Sector 7, elbow deep in the coolant-slicked guts of a fusion regulator, when the proximity alarms began to scream. It was a grating, metallic shriek that tasted of ozone in bad news. Dropping my ion torch, I wiped my hands on a rag that was more grease than fabric. My left hand, missing the ring and pinky fingers from a botched extraction 15 years ago, ached with the coming cold. We were not expecting company. Nobody comes to the anvil unless they are lost, dying, or looking for a place to hide their sins. By the time I reached the primary docking bay, the silicate delegation was already standing at attention. They were a cluster of crystalline entities from the Xylo's fringe, their bodies refracting the flickering amber light of the bay like shattered prisms. Their presence here, 10 parsecs from the nearest diplomatic route, was an anomaly that prickled the skin on the back of my neck. Vrax, the lead silicate, resonated. Its voice was a dissonant harmony of vibrating glass, transmitted through a translation collar that sounded like a grinding millstone. We bring a delivery from the high command of the Veth Valar hegemony. I stayed near my workbench, my hand hovering near a heavy-duty mag wrench. The Veth Valar. The name felt like a mouthful of ash. 30 years ago, I had written the decryption algorithms that shattered their orbital blockades during the Great Schism. I had destroyed 3 of their world ships without firing a single kinetic slug. They were supposed to be extinct, or at least toothless, rotting behind the containment fields of the consensus. I do not take deliveries from the hegemony, I said, my voice sounding like gravel hitting a metal plate, especially not from ghosts who owe me a bounty on my head. The silicate's internal light shifted from a calm sapphire to a mocking, oily yellow. You misunderstand, engineer. This is not a transaction. This is a message. They call it their ugliest gift, a reminder of what becomes of those who defy the natural order of the biological divine. Behind them, a containment pod hissed. It was a brutal slab-sided thing, etched with warnings in ancient Veth Valar script and the harsh block letters of the consensus treaty. The pneumatic locks disengaged with a sound like a dying gasp, and the front panel retracted into the floor. When the interior lights flickered on, the air in the docking bay seemed to drop 20 degrees. She was 6 feet of ruined potential. Her skin was a chaotic tapestry of violet and gray, mottled with surgical burn marks and biomechanical grafts that looked like they had been applied with a rusted spade. Her left arm was a heavy industrial-grade prosthetic, a primitive mass of pistons and scarred carbon fiber that belonged on a mining rig, not a living shoulder. But it was the synaptic shackle around her neck that made my stomach lurch. I knew that design. I had helped prototype the early iterations for the consensus military before I realized they were using them to turn prisoners into lobotomized puppets. The girl, or whatever the Veth Valar had turned her into, stood shivering in the frost of the pod. Her eyes were her only unmarred feature, deep thatch-on Tim pools that burned with a concentrated silent fury. She looked at the silicates, then at me, and her lip curled in a snarl that was more animal than human. Her designation is Lyraex, the silicate harmony continued, a chimera. A failure of the hybridization project. The hegemony decided that killing her was too merciful. They thought it more poetic to send their greatest shame to the man who brokered their defeat. I walked toward the pod, ignoring the way the silicate guards tensed. The other scrap rats and dock workers had gathered in the shadows, whispering. I heard the word monster ripple through the crowd. Someone muttered about venting the bay to the void before the thing got loose. She is a traitor, a murderer, and a glitch in the cosmic code, the silicate said, handing me a small biometric control pad. The shackle is keyed to your signature now, Vrax. You own this ugliness. Do with it as you wish. If she breathes without your permission, the shackle will fry her cerebral cortex in 3 milliseconds. I looked at the control pad. It was a slick, white piece of tech, the kind of clean, heartless machinery I had spent half my life building. Then I looked at the girl. She wasn't cowering. She was waiting. Waiting for the pain, waiting for the command, waiting for the end. Is she human? I asked. The silicate let out a sound like chimes in a storm. She is 52% human by genetic weight, The rest is experimentation. She is nothing. A broken toy for a broken engineer. I looked at the pad one more time, then I closed my hand over it and squeezed. The internal circuitry groaned, then snapped under the pressure of my reinforced work glove. I dropped the shattered pieces onto the deck plating. The silicate's light flared a violent, angry crimson. Do you realize what you have done? You have no way to control her. She will kill you before the cycle is out. I stepped right up to the edge of the pod. The girl didn't flinch. Up close, I could see that the SARs on her face weren't random. They followed the lines of her nerves, a roadmap of agony etched into her flesh. Step back, I said to the crystalline diplomats, pulling my heavy-duty ion torch from my belt. You cannot remove that shackle, the lead silicate warned. The integration is absolute. The moment you break the seal, the feedback loop will stop her heart. I have removed 3 of these before, I lied, my voice steady despite the hammer pulse in my chest. Granted, they were on corpses I was trying to salvage for parts, but the physics remain the same. Get off my station before I decide your crystalline asses count as scrap metal. The silicates retreated toward their shuttle, their movements stiff with indignation. Within minutes, their ship had detached, vanishing into the shimmering veil of the dead reach like a bad dream. I was left alone in the bay with a half-dozen terrified technicians and a woman who looked like she was made of nightmares. Show is over, I barked at the crowd. Back to your sectors. If I see anyone near the medical ward without a clearance chip, I will weld their boots to the hull. I turned back to the girl. She was still standing in the pod, her mechanical arm whirring with a low, predatory hum. Why? She rasped. Her voice was a wreckage of sound, like wind blowing through a graveyard. I looked at the jagged lines on her neck, the way the metal of the shackle bit into her collarbone. Because they call you an ugly gift, I said, reaching out a hand, then thinking better of it and pulling it back. And because I am tired of the people who think they get to decide what beauty looks like. I moved closer, the ion torch humming in my hand. I told you I was going to remove this, I whispered. It is going to hurt like a hull breach. But when I am done, I am going to put the stars in your hands. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a fleeting second, the fury in her amethyst eyes was replaced by something so fragile it nearly broke me. Hope. Don't move, I said. The work began. The medical ward of the Iron Anvil was a converted cargo container, lined with salvaged lead plating and smelling of antiseptic and ancient rust. I had spent 10 years filling it with equipment the consensus had deemed obsolete, a second-generation bioscanner, an automated suture rig, and a neural feedback chair that I had rebuilt from 3 different wrecks. Lyraex lay on the table, her body a stark contrast against the white synth gel padding. Without the pod's low-light filters, the extent of her modifications was even more harrowing. The Veth Valar hadn't just grafted metal to her bone, they had woven it into her biology. Fine silver filaments mapped her veins, glowing with a faint sickly luminescence. I'm going to start the dampening field now, I said, adjusting the dials on the overhead emitters. It will numb the physical pain, but the neural disconnect, that is going to feel like your brain is being scrubbed with wire wool. She didn't nod. She just stared at the ceiling, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. Do it, she rasped. I took a breath, trying to steady the tremor in my 3-fingered hand. Removing a synaptic shackle was a delicate operation even in a high-tech facility on Terra. Here, on a station held together by spit and stubbornness, it was suicide. I began by mapping the shackle's interfaces. The Veth Valar were masters of biotreachery. They had anchored the device directly into her C4 and C5 vertebrae. Every time she had a thought that deviated from their program parameters, the shackle would send a high-voltage spike directly into her spinal cord. It was a masterpiece of cruelty. Sector 8, status? I called out to my assistant, Jace, who was monitoring the station's power grid from the comms link. We are holding Kalen, Jace's voice crackled, sounding stressed. But the silicates didn't leave empty-handed. They are broadcasting a wideband signal. They are telling everyone in the Reach that we are harboring a Class A bioweapon. We have company coming, and they aren't coming for tea. Ignore them, I said, focusing on the first lead of the shackle. Give me 50 units of neurosuppressant. Now. The next 4 hours were a blur of micro-welding and nerve knitting. I had to bypass each of the 12 neural nodes before I could cut the physical casing of the shackle. One slip, one twitch, and Lyraex would become a vegetable. Sweat stung my eyes. The metallic tang of her blood filled the small room. It wasn't human red. It was a dark, bruised purple, shimmering with the nanites the hegemony had used to keep her alive during the grafting process. "Why do you care, engineer?" she asked suddenly. Her eyes were fixed on mine, searching for a lie. I paused, my ion scalpel hovering a millimeter from her jugular. "Because I spent too many years being the man who built the shackles," I said. "I thought I was protecting the consensus. I thought I was a hero for making the most efficient cages in the galaxy. Then the war ended, and I realized a cage is still a cage, no matter how shiny the bars are. I made the final cut. The shackle didn't just fall off, it screamed. A high-pitched electronic wail echoed through the ward as the internal failsafes tried to trigger the termination protocol. I slammed the override switch, my heart hammering against my ribs. Lyraex's body convulsed. Her mechanical arm slammed into the examination table, denting the heavy alloy. She let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated agony. "Stay with me," I shouted, grabbing her shoulders to keep her from throwing herself off the table. "Fight it, Lyraex. You are more than their code." The luminescence in her veins flared, turning from amethyst to a blinding star white. For a second, the entire medical ward was washed in a light so bright I had to close my eyes. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the screaming stopped. The heavy metal collar clattered to the floor, smoking and lifeless. Lyraex collapsed back onto the gel pad, her chest heaving. The raw, red tissue where the metal had met her skin looked like a fresh wound, but she was breathing. She was still there. I sat back on my stool, my legs feeling like they were made of water. My coveralls were soaked in sweat and purple blood. I reached out, my trembling fingers hovering over the synthetic skin grafts I had prepared. "It's over," I whispered. "You are free." She didn't move for a long time. Then she slowly lifted her right hand, the one that was still mostly human, and touched the bare skin of her neck. She traced the scars, the ridges of her vertebrae, the places where the metal had lived for years. "I can't hear them anymore," she said. Her voice was different now. The rasp was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting clarity. "The voices in the wire, they are gone." "They were never yours to begin with," I said, beginning to apply the synth skin. She turned her head to look at me. "Thank you, Kalen Vrax. But you should have let me die. The Veth Valor will not stop. They didn't send me here to be a gift. They sent me here to be a beacon." I paused, a piece of synth skin in my hand. "What do you mean, a beacon?" "The signal the silicates were broadcasting," she said, her amethyst eyes widening with a sudden, sharp clarity. "It wasn't just a warning to the Reach. It was a synchronization pulse. They are using the nanites in my blood as a directional array. They aren't coming to take me back. They are coming to erase the anvil from the star charts." "Kalen!" Jace's voice exploded over the comms link, frantic this time. "We have 5 signatures dropping out of hyperspace, Veth Valor interceptors, and they are hot. They have target locks on the primary reactor." I looked at Lyraex. She looked back at me, her face a mask of grief and resignation. "You see," she said, "I am the ugliest thing in the Empire. I bring nothing but death." I stood up, the exhaustion vanishing, replaced by a cold, familiar rage. I had spent 15 years hiding from the galaxy's cruelty, but it had finally followed me to my front door. "Not today," I said, grabbing my tool belt and heading for the door. "Jace, activate the scrapyard shield. Route all power from the life support in Sector 4 to the magnetic rails. But Kalen, Sector 4 is where we keep the..." Jace started. "Just do it," I roared. "And Lyraex?" She looked up. "Get off that table. If you want to prove you aren't a weapon, then help me defend the people who just gave you a home." She sat up, her mechanical arm whirring as it calibrated to its new free environment. She looked at the heavy industrial prosthetic, then at her scarred violet hands. "You said you would put the stars in my hands," she said softly. I paused at the doorway, looking back at her. The iron anvil groaned as the first kinetic slugs from the Veth Valor ships slammed into the outer hull. I lied about the stars, I said, a grim smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. But I can give you the next best thing. I can give you the trigger to the biggest railgun in this sector. Now move. We ran through the flickering corridors of the anvil, the station shaking under the assault. Around us, the scrap rats and miners were arming themselves with welding torches and makeshift slug throwers. They were terrified, but they were following us. We reached the primary control center, a cramped room filled with flickering monitors and the smell of ozone. I slammed my hand onto the main console, bringing up the tactical display. The 5 Veth Valor ships were circling us like sharks, their sleek, organic hulls glowing with an eerie green light. "Targeting computers are offline," Jace yelled over the sound of an exploding conduit. "We can't hit them in the dark." I looked at Lyraex. She was standing at the edge of the room, her eyes fixed on the display. She looked at the green blips, her pupils dilating until her eyes were nothing but pools of violet shadow. "I can see them," she said. "What?" I asked. "The nanites," she whispered. "They are talking to their ships. I can feel the data stream. I can see their vector, their shielding frequency, their engine heat. Can you link to the station's targeting array?" I asked, hope flaring in my chest like a supernova. She looked at her mechanical arm, the one the Veth Valar had designed for brute labor. She looked at the data ports on the console. "It will burn," she said. "My nervous system isn't designed for that kind of throughput." "Neither was mine when I rewrote their encryption codes 30 years ago," I said, stepping aside to give her the terminal. "We are all broken, Lyraex. That is why we fit together." She didn't hesitate. She plunged her mechanical hand into the open maintenance port of the console. The scream she let out this time wasn't from pain. It was from power. The luminescence in her skin turned from white to a brilliant, incandescent gold. The station's monitors, once flickering and dim, suddenly burst into life, filled with high-resolution telemetry that shouldn't have been possible. "Targeting locked," she rasped, her eyes glowing like twin stars. "Fire," I commanded. The iron anvil didn't just fire, it roared. The massive magnetic rails, hidden beneath layers of space debris and rusted plating, launched 3,000-kilogram slugs of solid tungsten at a fraction of the speed of light. The first Veth Valor ship didn't even have time to raise its shields. It vanished in a silent, blinding blossom of green fire. The second and third followed seconds later, their organic hulls shattered by the raw kinetic energy. The remaining 2 ships broke formation, fleeing back into the dark of the Reach. Silence fell over the control room. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of Lyraex as she pulled her hand from the console. She collapsed into my arms, her body vibrating with the aftershocks of the data transfer. "We did it," Jace whispered, looking at the empty tactical display. "We actually did it." I looked down at the woman in my arms. Her skin was still glowing faintly, the scars on her face looking like constellations against a violet sky. She wasn't ugly. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in the cold, dark void. "You did it," I whispered into her ear. She looked up at me, a tired, genuine smile touching her lips. "The stars, Kaelin," she said. "They were so bright." I held her tighter as the iron anvil drifted through the debris of our enemies. We were still in the dead Reach. We were still outcasts, fugitives, and scrap rats. But for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't running. The Veth Valor would come back. The consensus would come for their property. The galaxy was still a cruel, unforgiving place. But as I looked at the broken, beautiful woman in my arms, I knew one thing for certain. They were going to have to go through me first. The silence that followed the battle was heavier than the gunfire. It was the kind of silence that settled into your marrow, cold and unforgiving, like the vacuum waiting just outside the hull. The iron anvil was groaning, a deep, structural ache that vibrated through the soles of my boots. We had survived the initial surge, but survival on a junk station is just a temporary reprieve from the inevitable. I stayed in the med ward for 2 hours after the last interceptor flickered off our sensors. Lyraex was still unconscious, her body twitching as her nervous system tried to recalibrate after the massive data surge. The golden glow in her veins had faded to a dull, bruised amber, and the smell of ozone and burnt insulation hung thick in the air. "Kalen, you need to see this," Jace said, his voice coming through the overhead speakers. He sounded tired, the kind of exhaustion that no amount of synthetic caffeine could fix. "I just ran a diagnostic on the data burst she used to lock those targeting arrays. It wasn't just a signal, boss. It was a goddamn library." I wiped a smear of purple blood from my forehead and stood up, my knees popping like small caliber rounds. "How big? Big enough to crash the station's primary mainframe if she'd held it for another 10 seconds, Jace replied. "I've isolated the packet in a localized buffer. It's encrypted with a Veth Valar high-tier lattice. But there's something else. Human markers. Thousands of them." I looked down at Lyraex. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, ragged rhythm. I'd spent 45 years convinced that the universe was a giant machine made of gears that didn't care who they crushed. I'd built my life on the principle of fixing what was broken and ignoring what couldn't be mended. But looking at her, I felt a gear shift in my own chest, one I hadn't used in a very long time. "I'm coming up," I said. The walk from the med ward to the command center took me through Sector 4. The damage was extensive. A kinetic slug had punched through the outer shell, and the emergency force fields were shimmering with a violent blue light, holding back the void. A group of scrap rats was already there, welding plates over the breach. They looked up as I passed, their faces pale beneath layers of grime. "We heard she saved us," one of them said, a young kid named Alara, who couldn't have been more than 19. "The girl with the metal arm. Is it true? Did she really fry those Veth Valar clankers?" "She did her part," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "You do yours. Get that seal airtight before the secondary scrubbers flatline." I pushed past them, my mind racing. In the Reach, rumors traveled faster than light. By morning, every drifter and void junkie within 3 parsecs would know that the Iron Anvil had a secret weapon. And that meant the piece I had spent 10 years building was officially space dust. The command center was a chaotic mess of hollow screens and tangled cables. Jace was hunched over the main console, his fingers dancing across the keys. He was a good kid, a former consensus technician who'd bugged out after they'd ordered him to wipe a civilian colony's records to cover up a clerical error. He was the only person on this station I trusted with a decryption key. "Talk to me, Jace," I said, leaning over his shoulder. He tapped a key, and a 3-dimensional model of a DNA helix appeared in the air between us. It was beautiful and terrifying. Instead of the standard biological markers, the helix was overlaid with a shimmering lattice of silver light, nanotechnology woven directly into the genetic code. "This is her," Jace whispered. "The hegemony didn't just graft things onto her, Kalen. They used her as a living ledger. This data packet contains the complete genetic history of the hybridization project. Every human they kidnapped, every experiment that failed, every bioweapon they prototyped. It's all in there, hidden in the non-coding regions of her genome." I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. That's why they sent her to me. They didn't just want to insult me. They wanted to see if I'd find it. If I'd be the one to unlock the box they'd been building for 30 years. "And the human markers?" I asked. Jace swallowed hard. "They aren't just names, boss. They're brain maps, digital ghosts. They've been uploading the consciousness of their victims into this lattice. Lyraex isn't just one girl. She's a vessel for every soul they broke." I looked at the silver light dancing in the hollow. I had spent my career dealing with hardware, with things you could touch and weld and break. This was something else. This was a crime against the very definition of being alive. Can the consensus track this? "If they get close enough," "Yeah," Jay said. "This kind of data density emits a specific subspace signature. It's like a flare in the middle of a dark ocean. We can dampen it for a while, but eventually someone with a big enough sensor array is going to come knocking, and it won't be a couple of interceptors next time. It'll be the brass, the heavy hitters. Keep the dampening fields at 100%, I ordered. Use the backup generators if you have to. I'm going back down to talk to her." By the time I returned to the med ward, Lyraex was awake. She was sitting on the edge of the table, her mechanical arm resting heavily on her lap. She had pulled a discarded work shirt over her shoulders, but it couldn't hide the scars that climbed up her neck like vines. "You found it," she said. It wasn't a question. I stood in the doorway, the light from the corridor casting a long shadow across the floor. We found the ledger. We found the souls. She looked down at her hands, one flesh, one metal. My mother is in there, she whispered. Her voice was small, stripped of the fury she'd shown in the docking bay. She was a scientist on the Ganymede outposts. They took her when I was 5 years old. They told me they were making her part of something greater. They told me I should be proud to carry her legacy. I moved into the room and pulled up a chair, sitting a respectful distance away. How much do you remember? Everything, she said, her amethyst eyes locking onto mine. Every scream, every needle. Every time they told me I was an abomination, I could feel the ghosts in my blood whispering that they were wrong. But the voices are so loud now, Kaylin. Since the shackle broke, I can hear them all. They want justice. They want to be seen. I rubbed my missing fingers, a habit I had whenever I felt the weight of a decision. In the consensus, they'd call this a breakthrough. They'd take you to a clean, white lab on Mars or Terra, and they'd spend 20 years peeling you apart to see how it works. They'd call it progress. They'd call it a second chance for the victims. But they wouldn't ask you what you wanted, I said. Lyraex looked at me, a sharp, intelligent look that saw right through the grease-stained coveralls. And what do you want, engineer? Are you going to be the one who peels me apart? I looked at her, at the ruined skin and the defiant eyes, and I thought about the 3 dreadnoughts I'd destroyed during the war. I'd done it for the consensus, believing I was the hero. I'd spent the last 15 years realizing I was just a different kind of monster. I'm tired of peeling things apart to see how they break, I said. I'd rather keep something whole for once. I stood up and walked to the medical supply cabinet, pulling out a small handheld biomonitor. I'm going to give you a localized sedative for the neural burn. It'll quiet the voices for a few hours. You need sleep, Lyraex. Real sleep. She watched as I approached, her body tensing, then slowly relaxing. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. To you, I'm just a pile of Veth Valor scrap that brought a war to your doorstep. I paused, the biomonitor humming in my hand. Because when I was 30 years old, I watched a human colony burn because I'd made a mistake in a cooling pipe calculation. I told myself it was just an accident, just a glitch in the machine. But people aren't machines, and mistakes aren't just glitches. You are the result of 1,000 choices made by cruel men. I'm choosing to make a different one. I pressed the monitor against her arm, and she let out a long, shuddering breath as the sedative took hold. Kaylin? She whispered, her eyes fluttering as she drifted off. Yeah? You said you'd put the stars in my hands. I did, I said, pulling the thermal blanket over her. What did you mean? I meant that one day you're going to look at yourself and you won't see the scars. You'll see the light that's been trying to get out this whole time. I stayed with her until her breathing leveled out. Then I went back to work. There were 5 sectors to repair, 3 force fields to stabilize, and an entire station of terrified people to convince that we weren't all going to die by sunrise. It was 35 minutes past midnight when Jace called me again. Boss, we have a problem. What now? It's not the Veth Valar, Jace said, his voice trembling. It's a consensus long-range probe. It just dropped out of warp at the edge of the reach. It's pinging our subspace signature. How long, I asked, my heart sinking. At their current speed? 3 hours, maybe 4. And Kaylin, it's not just a probe, not. There's a carrier signal behind it, a heavy cruiser, the Aegis. I closed my eyes for a second, the darkness behind my lids feeling like the void itself. The Aegis, Commander Harlan's ship. Harlan had been my rival back in the research division. He was a man who believed that the end always justified the means, and he'd spent 10 years trying to find out where I disappeared to. Bug out? Jace asked. We can vent the atmosphere in the non-essential sectors and try to make a run for the nebula. No, I said, looking at the sleeping girl on the med table. If we run, we're just proves they're right. We stay, we fix the station, and we get ready to show them that even a pile of junk has teeth. I walked out of the med ward, the metallic thrum of the iron anvil feeling like a heartbeat. We were broken, all of us. But sometimes it's the broken things that are the hardest to kill. The Aegis arrived at 5 in the morning, appearing on our sensors like a sharpened blade cutting through the velvet black of the Reach. It was a beautiful ship, 3 kilometers of polished hull and high-output ion engines. To anyone else, it was a symbol of peace and order. To me, it was a floating prison for anyone who didn't fit the consensus mold. Station Iron Anvil, this is Commander Harlan of the consensus vessel Aegis. The voice boomed over the emergency frequency. The signal was crisp, clear, and devoid of any warmth. We have detected a high-density biosignature emanating from your coordinates. You are in possession of restricted hegemony materials. Power down your shields and prepare for boarding. I sat in the command chair, a battered piece of foam and cracked leather that had seen better days. Jace was at the comm station, his face ashen in the light of the monitors. "Tell them we have a hull breach in Sector 7 and our docking clamps are jammed," I said. "Tell them we need 2 hours to stabilize." "Kalen, they aren't going to buy that," Jace whispered. "They don't have to buy it. They just have to hesitate," I replied. I checked the status of the scrapyard shield. After the battle with the interceptors, the capacitors were at 40%. If the Aegis opened up with its main batteries, we'd be nothing but floating debris in 3 minutes. Lyraex walked into the command center then. She was wearing a pair of my old flight overalls, the sleeves rolled up to reveal her mechanical prosthetic. She looked rested, but there was a tension in her shoulders that told me she knew exactly who was outside our door. "They are here for me," she said. It wasn't a question. "They are here for the ledger," I corrected. "You're just the box they want to open." She walked to the viewport, looking out at the massive cruiser. "They'll take you too, Kalen. They'll charge you with treason. They'll put you in a cell and forget you ever existed." "I've spent 15 years being a ghost," I said, standing up. "Another few years in a cell won't make much difference. But they aren't getting you." "Why?" she asked, turning to face me. The amethyst light in her eyes was sharp. "Why risk everything for a girl you found in a box?" "Because I'm tired of seeing the shiny people take things from the dust," I said. "And because you're the first thing I've seen in a decade that actually worth fighting for." I turned back to the console. "Jace, open a channel." The screen flickered to life, revealing the bridge of the Aegis. Commander Harlan was exactly as I remembered him. Tall, immaculate in his silver and blue uniform, his gray hair cut with military precision. He looked at me, and a slow, cold smile spread across his face. "Kalen Vrax," he said, "I heard you'd crawled into a hole at the end of the galaxy. I didn't think you'd be foolish enough to start a war from inside it." "I'm not starting anything, Harlan," I said. "I'm just minding my own business. You're the one trespassing in neutral space." "Neutral space is a luxury for those who follow the law, Vrax," Harlan replied. "You are harboring a Veth Valor Chimera. That entity is a violation of the Geneva Accords and a threat to interstellar security. Hand her over and maybe I can convince the Council to let you keep your little scrap heap." I looked at the camera, making sure Harlan could see every grease stain on my face. "She isn't an entity, Harlan. Her name is Lyraex, and she's a resident of this station. According to the Reach Charter, that makes her my responsibility." Harlan's smile vanished. "You always were an idealist, Kalen. It's what made you a mediocre soldier and a dangerous engineer. You have 10 minutes to drop your shields. If you don't, I will use the Aegis's tractor beams to pull that station apart piece by piece." The screen went black. "Well," Jace said, let out a long breath. "That went about as well as a reactor leak." "What's the move, boss?" I looked at Lyraex. She was staring at her mechanical hand, her fingers twitching in a rhythmic, calculated pattern. "Can you talk to the station again?" I asked her. "Not just the targeting array. The whole thing." She looked up, her expression uncertain. "The Anvil isn't a Veth Valar ship. It doesn't have a biological interface. It's just metal and wires." "It's metal and wires that I've spent 10 years weaving together," I said. "It's a mess, Lyraex. It's a disaster of improvised circuitry and salvaged logic cores. It's exactly like you, broken in all the right places." I walked over to the primary environmental control unit and pulled off the maintenance panel, revealing a bird's nest of glowing fiber optics. "I've been building a bridge," I whispered. "I didn't know I was building it for you, but it's here. I call it the synaptic loom. It's a direct interface between the station's core and a neural link. Lyraex stepped toward the panel, her amethyst eyes reflecting the glow of the fibers. You want me to become the station? I want you to lead it, I said. Harlan thinks we're just a pile of junk. He thinks he can just pull us apart because we don't have a centralized computer or a unified shield grid. But if you can weave these systems together, if you can coordinate the power flow and the defense drones, we can be something he's never seen before. It will hurt, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I know, I said, taking her hand. But you won't be doing it alone. I'll be right here, managing the hardware. Jace will be on the comms. And the people of the Anvil, they're already arming the drones. As if on cue, the comms link chimed. It was Alara from Sector 7. Boss? We heard the consensus is here. We aren't letting them take the girl. We've got 40 mining drones and a dozen repurposed cargo loaders ready to go. Just tell us where to point them. I looked at Lyraex. Do you hear that? She closed her eyes and I saw a single silver tear track down her scarred cheek. They don't even know me, she whispered. They know what it's like to be discarded, I said. That's enough. Lyraex took a deep breath and reached into the maintenance panel. Her fingers brushed the glowing fibers, and her entire body stiffened. A soft, golden hum began to emanate from her skin, and the station's lights flared, then settled into a steady, pulsing rhythm. I see it, she gasped, her eyes flying open. I see every wire, every pipe. I can feel the air moving through the vents. I can feel the heat from the reactor. Kaylin. It's beautiful. I turned back to my console, my fingers flying as I began to route the power flow through her neural nodes. The scrapyard shield began to glow with a new intensity, the flickering amber light turning into a solid, brilliant gold. Harlan is moving, Jace shouted. He's launching the boarding craft. I looked at the tactical display. 20 small, high-speed shuttles were streaking toward the Anvil. They were aiming for the docking bays and the primary airlocks. Lyraex, I said, my voice low and steady. Show them what a pile of junk can do. She didn't speak. She just raised her mechanical arm, and outside the station, 40 mining drones ignited their thrusters. They didn't move like drones. They moved like a swarm of angry hornets, their movements coordinated with a precision that was terrifying to behold. The drones intercepted the boarding craft in the shadow of the Aegis. They didn't use weapons. They used themselves. They slammed into the shuttles, their heavy-duty drills and cutting torches tearing through the consensus armor like it was paper. On the Aegis bridge, Harlan must have been losing his mind. His immaculate, high-tech fleet was being dismantled by a group of flying garbage trucks. They're firing the main batteries, Jace screamed. The Aegis's forward cannons erupted in a blinding flash of blue energy. The impact hit the scrapyard shield with the force of a falling moon. The station buckled, the metal screaming under the pressure, but the shield held. Lyraex was shaking, blood beginning to leak from her nose. The throughput was too high, the data density too great for her human hybrid heart to handle. Hold on, I whispered, reaching out to steady her. Just a little longer. I am holding, she rasped, her voice sounding like a chorus of 1,000 voices. I am the Anvil, and I will not break. She sent a command through the synaptic loom, and the station's secondary reactor, a salvaged unit from a derelict freighter, ignited. It wasn't power for shields, it was power for a signal. Jace, broadcast the ledger, I ordered. What? Jace looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Boss, that's classified hegemony data. Not anymore, I said. We're broadcasting it to every relay station in the Reach. We're sending it to the Media Corps, the independent colonies, and the fringe worlds. We're showing the galaxy what the Veth Valor did and what the consensus was willing to ignore. The data streamed out of the Iron Anvil in a massive, unstoppable burst. It was a tide of information, of names, of faces, of agony. It was the truth, and once it was out, Harlan couldn't take it back. On the Aegis, the weapons fire stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of the void. It was the silence of 1 billion people suddenly realizing that the world they lived in was built on a foundation of lies. Harlan appeared on the screen again. His uniform was still perfect, but his face was deathly pale. You've destroyed us, Verax. You've destroyed the peace. I looked at him, then I looked at Lyraex, who was leaning against me, her eyes tired but bright. "No, Harlan. I've just finished the work I started 30 years ago. I've broken the machine. Now the people get to decide what to build next." Harlan stared at me for a long time. Then he gave a sharp micro-nod to someone off camera. The Aegis began to turn, its massive engines glowing as it prepared for a warp jump. "They'll come for you, Kalen," Harlan said. "Not just the consensus. Everyone. You have the most valuable thing in the galaxy on that station." "I know," I said, looking at Lyraex, "and I'm going to make sure she stays free." The Aegis vanished into hyperspace, leaving us alone in the dark. Lyraex pulled her hand from the maintenance panel and slumped to the floor. I caught her, my missing fingers gripping her shoulder. She was cold, her skin pale, but her heart was beating strong. "Is it over?" she whispered. I looked around the command center. Jace was laughing, a hysterical, relieved sound. Outside, the people of the Anvil were cheering over the comms link. The station was still broken, still rattling, still a pile of junk, but the stars felt a little closer than they had before. "No," I said, brushing a strand of Tim hair from her forehead. "It's just the beginning." I looked at my hands, the hands that had built cages and broken worlds. They were covered in grease and blood, but they were steady. I'd spent 45 years trying to find a place where I didn't have to care about the universe. I'd finally found it, and it was right here, in the middle of a war I hadn't wanted to fight. I'm Kalen Vrax, I thought, and I'm a broken man on a broken station. And for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. We sat there on the floor of the command center, the silence of the Reach finally feeling like peace. We had a long way to go, and the entire galaxy was about to come knocking on our door. But for now, we were still standing, and that was enough. I looked at Lyraex and she smiled, a small, tired thing that was more beautiful than any polished consensus ship. She wasn't an ugly gift. She was the most precious thing I'd ever been given, and I was going to make sure the whole damn universe knew it. The Iron Anvil was never designed to be a cradle. It was a tomb for dead machines, a jagged hollow in a rock where the unwanted things of the galaxy came to rust in peace. But 3 weeks after we broadcast the ledger, the Anvil was no longer quiet. It was screaming with the life of 500 refugees who had nowhere else to go. They arrived in ships that looked like they were held together by prayer and duct tape. Some were former Veth Valor prisoners, half-starved and hollow-eyed. Others were hybrids like Lyraex, their modifications weeping from neglect. And then there were the ordinary people, the ones who had seen the broadcast and realized the consensus they paid taxes to was just a cleaner version of the monster they feared. "Kalen, the air scrubbers in Sector 9 are hitting the red," Jace's voice crackled in my ear. He sounded like he was running on 3 hours of sleep and a gallon of industrial-grade stimulant. "We've got twice the population we're rated for. If we don't get more oxygen candles, we're all going to be taking a long, permanent nap by Tuesday." I didn't look up from the hydraulic stabilizer I was wrestling with. My 3-fingered hand was slick with hydraulic fluid, and my joints felt like they had been dipped in vinegar. "Tell the Sector 9 leads to institute a 6-hour sleep rotation. Less movement means less oxygen burned, and tell them to stop complaining about the smell. It's the scent of not being dead." "I'll tell them, boss, but they're getting twitchy," Jace said, his voice dropping an octave. "Some of the new arrivals are looking at Lyraex like she's a holy relic, and the rest are looking at her like she's a ticking nuke. It's a real powder keg down here." I finally managed to lock the stabilizer, the metal groaning as it took the weight of the station's shifting hull. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Just keep your 6 covered, and don't let anyone touch the primary valves." I wiped my hands on my coveralls and stepped out into the corridor. The Anvil felt different now. The walls were lined with sleeping mats, the air heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies and cheap nutrient paste. People watched me pass, some with hope, some with a simmering resentment that made the hair on my neck stand up. I found Lyraex in the center of the mess hall. She wasn't eating. She was surrounded by a dozen children, most of them hybrids with crude mechanical limbs or scarred skin. She was showing them her mechanical arm, letting them watch the tiny, intricate servos move as she flexed her fingers. "It's not a cage," she was saying, her voice soft but carrying across the room. "It's just a tool, like a hammer or a torch. It doesn't tell you who you are. You tell it what to do. A young boy with a prosthetic eye reached out and touched the silver plating of her forearm. Does it hurt? He whispered. Sometimes, Lyraex said, and her amethyst eyes caught mine as I approached. But the pain just means the nerves are still there. It means you're still you. I cleared my throat, and the crowd of kids scattered like a school of fish. Lyraex stood up, the old flight overalls I'd given her looking more worn than they had a week ago. They're terrified, Kaylin, she said, her voice dropping as I reached her. They hear the voices too. Not the ledger, but the fear. It's like a subspace frequency that won't stop humming. Everyone's terrified, I said, looking at the weary faces around the room. We're sitting in the middle of a junk pile with a target the size of a planet on our backs. Fear is the only thing we've got plenty of. She stepped closer, the golden luminescence in her skin flickering in time with her heartbeat. I can feel the ghosts getting louder. The more people who come here, the more memories they bring. It's like I'm a sponge for every bad choice the Veth ever made. I don't know how much longer I can keep the ledger locked in the buffer. Then we'll build a bigger buffer, I said, though I knew I was lying. There wasn't enough hardware in the Reach to contain the kind of trauma she was carrying. Kaylin! Jace's voice cut through the room, broadcast over the emergency speakers. We've got a civilian freighter coming in hot. They're ignored the docking cues and they're blowing through the proximity sensors. It's the Star-Crossed. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. The Star-Crossed was a notorious smuggler ship run by a piece of work named Silas Vane. Silas didn't do anything for free, and he certainly didn't come to the Reach unless there was a payday involved. Lyraex, stay here, I ordered. Jace, get the security drones to the primary bay. Tell the scrap rats to stay frosty. We've got a visitor. I reached the docking bay just as the Star-Crossed slammed into the magnetic clamps. The ship was a mess of carbon-scorched plating and illegal engine mods. As the hatch hissed open, Silas Vane stepped out, looking exactly like the vacuum sucker he was. He was wearing an expensive consensus silk coat over a dirty flight suit, and his smile was as wide as a hull breach. Vrax! He shouted, his voice echoing off the metal walls. I heard you were running a charity ward for the galaxy's mistakes. I figured I'd bring you some supplies for a modest fee, of course. I stayed 5 meters away, my hand resting on the hilt of my mag wrench. What are you doing here, Silas? The Reach isn't your usual hunting ground. Silas stepped onto the bay floor, his eyes darting around, taking in the state of our defenses. Business is booming, Kaylin. Ever since you dropped that data bomb, the market for biotech has gone through the roof. The consensus wants it back. The Veth Valor want it gone. And me? I just want to get paid. He gestured back toward his ship. I've got 50 crates of medical supplies, 3,000 oxygen candles, and enough nutrient paste to feed the circus for 6 months. All I want in exchange is a chat with the girl. The silence that followed was absolute. The scrap rats who had been lurking in the shadows stepped out, their faces hard. Silas didn't flinch. He knew he had the only thing we needed to survive another week. The girl isn't for sale, Silas, I said, my voice low and dangerous. I'm not buying, Silas replied, his smile fading into something sharper. I'm negotiating. I've got a message from a group you might remember. The Synergy Syndicate. They think you're a real hero, Kaylin. They want to offer the Iron Anvil their protection. All you have to do is let them take a few readings from the girl. No harm done. She stays here, they get the data, and everyone goes home happy and full of air. I felt a surge of cold fury. The Syndicate were the ones who had supplied the raw materials for the Veth Valar's experiments. They were the ones who had profited from every scream Lyraex had ever let out. Get off my station, Silas, I said. Now! Silas looked at the crates being unloaded by his crew. You sure about that, Vrax? You look at your people lately? They're starving. They're suffocating. You think they're going to thank you for being a man of principle when their kids start flatlining? I took a step forward, but before I could do anything, Lyraex was there. She had followed me down despite my orders. She stood in the light of the docking bay, her mechanical arm whirring with a low, rhythmic thrum. You want data? She asked Silas, her amethyst eyes burning with a light that made him take a step back. Silas swallowed, his bravado wavering. Just a few scans, sweetheart. Nothing painful. Lyraex walked right up to him. She was taller than him, her presence filling the bay like a gathering storm. "I'll give you the data," she said, her voice sounding like a chorus of thousands. "I'll give you every memory of the needles. I'll give you the feeling of your DNA being rewritten while you're still awake. I'll give you the ghosts. Do you want them, Silas? Do you want to carry them?" She reached out with her mechanical hand and gripped Silas's shoulder. Not hard, but enough to make the metal groan. The golden luminescence in her skin flared, and for a second, a holographic projection of a distorted DNA helix flickered in the air between them. Silas screamed. It wasn't a loud sound, but a thin, jagged rasp of pure terror. He scrambled back, tripping over his own boots as he fled toward his ship. "Bug out!" he shrieked at his crew. "Close the hatch! Go!" The star-crossed detached so fast it nearly took the docking clamps with it. It vanished into the void, leaving behind 10 crates of medical supplies that Silas's crew hadn't had time to pull back in. The docking bay was silent. The scrap rats looked at Lyraex, then at me. There was no cheering. There was only the realization that the world outside was closing in, and that the gift we were protecting was more dangerous than we had ever imagined. Lyraex turned to me, her face pale, the luminescence fading back into the bruised amethyst of her skin. "I almost let them out, Kalen," she whispered. "The ghosts. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to kill everyone who ever looked at them as a payday." "But you didn't," I said, reaching out to steady her. "You held it together." She looked at the crates on the floor. "At what cost?" Silas was right. "We need those supplies." "I'm a monster, Kalen. I'm a monster who is starving the people who are trying to help me." "You are not a monster," I said, though my own voice sounded hollow in the vast empty bay. "You're the only person here who's telling the truth." I looked at the crates. 10 crates of medical supplies wouldn't even last us 4 days. The test had begun, and I was already losing the math. The humanistic dream of the anvil was being weighed against the cold, hard reality of oxygen and food, and the scales were tipping toward the dark. I looked at Lyraex, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was the cost of her own survival, the weight of the soul she carried, and the realization that beauty, real beauty, was a luxury that required more than just courage. It required air to breathe, and the air was running out. 48 hours later, the air in Sector 9 finally went foul. It wasn't a sudden disaster, just a slow, creeping bitterness that tasted like old pennies and wet wool. Jace had rerouted all available power to the scrubbers, but the filters were clogged with the dust of 5 centuries of neglect. We had 3 days, maybe 4, before the carbon dioxide levels hit the lethargy threshold. I was in the engineering bay, trying to bypass the primary intake valves, when the proximity alarm chimed again. This time, it wasn't a jagged scream. It was a single, pure note that felt like a needle in the brain. "Consensus diplomatic frequency," Jace said over the comms. His voice was flat, the kind of monotone that comes from being too tired to be scared anymore. "It's a single shuttle, no escort. They're requesting parley." "Who is it?" I asked, wiping the sweat from my eyes. "The ID tag says Inquisitor Vane," Jace replied. I stopped what I was doing. Inquisitor wasn't a military rank. It was a title from the Consensus Ethical Oversight Committee, the people who were supposed to make sure the galaxy stayed pretty and polite. Vane was a name I knew. She was the woman who had signed the order to retire the Ganymede research teams when their results became too messy for the evening news. "Let her in," I said, "but tell the scrap rats to keep their sights on her. If she so much as sneezes without a permit, I want her shuttle vented to the Reach." Inquisitor Vane didn't look like a monster. She was a woman in her late 60s, with iron-gray hair pulled back into a severe bun, and a voice that sounded like silk being pulled over glass. She stepped out of her shuttle in Docking Bay 3, her white and gold robes a blinding contrast to the grime of the anvil. She wasn't carrying a weapon, she was carrying a briefcase. "Kalen Vrax," she said, her eyes scanning the docking bay with a clinical detachment. "I see the years haven't been kind to you. Or perhaps you've simply found the environment that matches your internal state." I stayed on the balcony above her, my arms crossed over my chest. "I like the rust, Vane. It's honest. What do you want?" I want to offer you a solution to your problem, she said, gesturing toward the hundreds of people watching from the shadows. You have 523 souls on this station. You have 4 days of breathable air. You have 0 combat-grade shields and 0 allies in the Galactic Council. You are not a sanctuary, Kalen. You are a mass grave waiting for a shovel. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a small, high-density storage drive. This contains the coordinates to a terraformed world in the Epsilon cluster. It's a sanctuary planet managed by the Ethical Oversight Committee. It has food, medical facilities, and enough oxygen to last 1,000 years. It is a place where these people can live in peace, away from the wars of the core. And the price, I asked, knowing the answer before the words left my mouth. Vane looked at the med ward entrance where Lyraex was standing. The girl, she said, the ledger is a danger to the stability of the galaxy. It contains bioweapon protocols that could restart the war in a heartbeat. We cannot allow it to remain in the hands of an unstable hybrid or a disgraced engineer. Give us the girl, and the 522 other people on this station will be moved to the Epsilon cluster by sunset tomorrow. The docking bay went so quiet you could hear the hum of the light fixtures. I looked at the crowd. I saw Alara, the 19-year-old scrap rat who had built the drone swarm. I saw the mother with the hybrid child whose scales were finally starting to heal. I saw 500 people who were holding their breath, waiting for me to say the word that would save their lives. And then I looked at Lyraex. She was standing at the edge of the shadows, her mechanical arm hanging limp at her side. She didn't look like a warrior. She looked like a girl who had finally run out of places to hide. It's a fair trade, Kalen, Lyraex said, her voice clear and devoid of emotion. 500 lives for one. Any engineer can do that math. Vane smiled, a small, triumphant thing. She understands the weight of the crown, Vrax. Do you? You spent your life building cages. Here is one that is gilded and safe. Why resist the inevitable? I looked at Vane, then at the drive in her hand. I thought about the 3 dreadnoughts. I thought about the thousands of people who had died because I'd been practical. Because I'd made the choices that seemed logical at the time. The humanistic theme I'd been clinging to, the idea that every broken piece had inherent value, was being crushed by the sheer mass of 500 lives. If I chose Lyraex, I was condemning 500 people to a slow, suffocating death. If I chose the 500, I was betraying the very thing that had made me feel human again. I walked down the stairs, my boots clanging on the metal. I stood in front of Vane, the smell of her expensive perfume clashing with the scent of Sector 9. You're a real piece of work, Vane, I said, my voice barely a whisper. You come here and talk about ethics while you're holding a gun to the heads of 500 refugees. I am a pragmatist, Vrax, she replied, her eyes cold. I am saving what can be saved. I turned to the crowd. You heard her, I shouted. She's offering you a world with air. She's offering you a world where you don't have to worry about being scrapped by a Veth Valor interceptor. All you have to do is let her take the girl. A low murmur rippled through the bay. People looked at each other, their eyes filled with a desperate, hungry hope. I saw a man in the front row, a former miner with a mechanical eye, take a step forward. We're dying here, Kalen, he said, his voice cracking. My son hasn't had a full meal in 3 days. We didn't ask to be part of your war. I looked at him. I know you didn't, Marcus. None of us did. He looked at Lyraex. We're sorry, miss. We really are. But there's so many of us. Lyraex nodded, a single sharp movement. I understand, Marcus. It's okay. She walked toward Vane, her boots echoing on the deck plates. I'm ready, she said. Just give them the coordinates. Make sure they get to the ships. Vane reached out to take her arm, her fingers curling around the scarred skin with a clinical possessiveness. Wise choice, my dear. You'll be much more useful to us in a controlled environment. I watched them. My heart felt like it was being pulled through a needle's eye. The lesson I was supposed to learn, that beauty isn't a luxury, but a fundamental right of the soul, was being traded for a breath of air. The cost of not learning it was right there in front of me. A girl who had finally found her own name, being turned back into a designation. Wait, I said. Vane paused, her hand still on Lyraex's arm. Is there a problem, Kalen? I looked at Lyraex. She was looking at me with a profound, terrifying sadness. She was willing to do it. She was willing to become the cage again to save the people who were willing to throw her away. The problem, I said, walking toward them, is that I'm a really bad engineer. I always overcomplicate the designs. I reached out and grabbed the storage drive from Vane's hand. She didn't have time to react before I slammed it onto the floor and crushed it under the heel of my boot. The high-density plastic shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. "Kalen!" Jace shouted from the balcony, his voice filled with shock. Vane's face went white. "You've just murdered 500 people, Lyraex." That was the only copy. "No," I said, and I felt a strange, terrifying lightness in my chest. "That was a lie. You were never going to take them to a sanctuary. You were going to take them to a labor colony in the fringe, where you could keep them quiet and use them as leverage against anyone who stepped out of line." Vane's eyes narrowed. "You have no proof of that." "I don't need proof," I said. "I know your work, Vane. I've been reading the ledger. I know about the Epsilon cluster. It's a graveyard for messy results." I turned back to the crowd. They were staring at the shattered drive, their hope dying in real time. The murmur of resentment was growing into a roar. "He killed us," someone shouted. "He chose the monster over us." I stepped in front of Lyraex, my mag wrench held tight in my hand. "Listen to me," I roared, my voice drowning out the noise. "You think air is the only thing that keeps you alive? You think a sanctuary with a consensus flag on it is going to make you free? Look at her," I pointed at Lyraex. "They made her a monster because they thought she was just a tool. They think you're just tools too. If we give her up, we're telling them they're right. We're telling them that our lives are only worth what we can trade for a breath of air." The crowd hesitated. The miner, Marcus, was shaking with rage. "We can't breathe principle, Kalen." "Then we'll fix the scrubbers," I shouted. "We'll pull the station apart and rebuild them from the hull plating if we have to. But we aren't giving up our souls for a golden cage. Not today. Not ever." Lyraex stepped up beside me. She didn't say a word, but the golden luminescence in her skin began to hum, a low, vibrant frequency that seemed to resonate with the very metal of the station. Vane looked at us, her silk robes fluttering in the stale air of the bay. "You're a fool, Kalen Vrax. A beautiful, tragic fool. You have 2 days left. Use them to write your eulogies." She turned and walked back into her shuttle. The hatch hissed shut and the ship detached, vanishing into the reach without a sound. The docking bay was silent again, but the silence was different now. It was the silence of a people who had been forced to look at their own reflections and didn't like what they saw. They didn't cheer. They didn't move. They just stared at us. Lyraex looked at the shattered drive on the floor. "You shouldn't have done that, Kalen." They were right. "I am just one girl." "No," I said, looking at the gray, toxic air swirling in the bay. "You're the only thing that makes this junk pile worth more than the scrap metal." I looked at the crowd. Marcus was still standing there, his head bowed. He didn't look at us. He just turned and walked back towards Sector 9. "Jace," I said into the comms link. My voice felt like it was coming from a long way away. "Start the manual bypass on the Sector 9 scrubbers. Tell the scrap rats we're going dark on all non-essential power. We're going to be living in the cold for a while." The turning point had passed. I had chosen the soul over the survival, and now I had to live with the consequences. The air was getting thinner, the voices were getting louder, and the entire galaxy was waiting for us to die. But as I looked at Lyraex, I saw that the stars in her eyes were brighter than they had ever been. She was terrified, yes. But for the first time, she wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep us breathing a little while longer. The air in Sector 9 didn't just smell like old pennies anymore. It felt like breathing warm, wet sand. It clung to the back of your throat. A thick, invisible layer of despair that made every thought feel like it was moving through cold molasses. By the second day of the blackout, the lethargy had turned into a low-grade fever that hummed through the station. I walked past rows of refugees huddled in the dim, red emergency lighting, their eyes reflecting a hunger that wasn't just for food, but for a single clean breath of oxygen. We were flatlining, and everyone knew it. "Kalen, you're swaying again," Lyraex said, her voice cutting through the fog in my head. I blinked, realizing I had been staring at a rusted bulkhead for 3 minutes, wondering if the metal was sweating or if it was just my own hands shaking. "I'm fine," I rasped. "Hey, just thinking about the plumbing." "You're a terrible liar for a man who spent 15 years hiding his identity," she replied. She reached out with her organic hand, her fingers light against my forehead. "You're burning up. The CO2 is toxic for humans at this saturation. You need to sit down before you check out permanently." I pushed her hand away, more gently than I intended. "We don't have time for a nap." "Jace?" Jace's face appeared on a nearby flickering monitor, his skin a sickly shade of gray-green under the red strobes. "Still here, boss. Barely. The scrubbers in Sector 9 have officially given up the ghost. We've got 48 hours of breathable air left in the main hub, and that's if nobody does anything strenuous, like, breathing." "What about the derelict?" I asked, leaning against the wall. "I found it," Jace said, tapping a key that brought up a grainy long-range scan. "It's an old consensus heavy hauler, the ghost of Ethelgard. It's been drifting in the debris field of the Dead Reach for 20 years. If the scans are right, it's still got 2 pristine industrial-grade filtration units in its secondary engine room." "How far?" 10,000 kilometers, Jace said, "but it's deep in the scrap belt. Navigating the Iron Anvil's shuttle through that mess is going to be like trying to thread a needle during an earthquake." "And Kalen?" "The Ethelgard didn't just stop. It was a plague ship. They quarantined it during the first Vethvalar outbreak and let it drift." I looked at Lyraex. She was watching the screen, her amethyst eyes calculating. She wasn't human enough to be as affected by the carbon dioxide, but the internal strain of carrying the ledger was making the golden light in her veins flicker like a dying candle. "We go," I said. "Boss, that's a suicide run," Jace whispered. "Even if you make it past the scrap debris, that ship is a death trap." "It's better than sitting here waiting to turn into a bag of meat in a vacuum," I snapped. "Lyraex, get your gear." "Ilara!" The 19-year-old scrap rat appeared from behind a stack of crates, a plasma cutter slung over her shoulder. "I'm in," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "My mom's in Sector 9. If those scrubbers don't start humming, she's done for." We reached the shuttle bay 20 minutes later. The shuttle was a snub-nosed bucket of bolts we called the Rusty Needle. It had no shields, no weapons, and a thruster assembly that screamed like a banshee every time you pushed it past 50%. I climbed into the pilot's seat, my missing fingers fumbling with the ignition sequence. Lyraex sat in the co-pilot's chair, her mechanical arm whirring as she linked her internal sensors to the shuttle's primitive nav computer. "I'm bridging the gap," she said, her voice gaining that strange, multi-layered quality I'd heard during the battle. "I can feel the debris field. It's not just rocks, Kalen. It's ghosts. Thousands of pieces of broken history, all screaming in the dark." "Don't listen to them," I said, slamming the throttle forward. "Just find us a path." The launch was a bone-jarring kick that sent the Rusty Needle spiraling into the black. Outside the viewport, the Iron Anvil looked like a dying ember, its lights flickering against the massive, looming shadow of the Reach. We dived into the scrap belt, the shuttle groaning as small pieces of debris pelted the hull like a hailstorm of frozen lead. "Left!" Lyraex shouted, her golden luminescence flaring. I yanked the stick, the shuttle groaning as we narrowly avoided a shattered reactor core from some forgotten war. The ghost of Ethelgard loomed out of the darkness, a 300-meter skeleton of rusted titanium and jagged glass. It looked less like a ship and more like a graveyard, floating in a sea of silver dust. We matched its rotation and clamped onto the secondary airlock. The sound of metal meeting metal echoed through the shuttle like a funeral bell. "Masks on," I ordered, pulling a respirator over my face. "We don't know what's still crawling around in there." The air inside the Ethelgard was freezing, the temperature hovering at negative 40 degrees Celsius. Our breath came out in thick plumes of frost as we moved through the corridors, our flashlights cutting narrow paths through the oppressive dark. Everything was covered in a layer of gray rime, the frozen remains of the crew's final moments. "This place gives me the creeps," Ilara whispered, her flashlight beam dancing over a frozen corpse huddled in a doorway. "Stay focused on the mission, kid," I said, though my own skin was crawling. "Engineering is 2 levels down." We moved deeper into the belly of the ship, the floor plates groaning under our boots. Lyraex led the way, her mechanical arm acting as a dowsing rod for the energy signatures of the filtration units. Suddenly she stopped, her head tilting to the side. "Do you hear that?" she asked. "The only thing I hear is my own heart trying to beat its way out of my ribs," I said. "No," Lyraex said, her amethyst eyes glowing. "It's a hum, a high-frequency oscillation. It's not consensus tech. It's Veth Valor." I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. The hegemony had been here. They hadn't just quarantined the ship. They had used it. We turned the corner into the secondary engine room, and the flashlights revealed a nightmare. The two filtration units were there, large cylinders of polished chrome, but they were covered in a web of biological growth. Thick pulsing veins of violet matter were wrapped around the machinery, feeding off the residual power of the ship's core. "It's a bioforge," I whispered, stepping closer. They were using the filtration units as a nutrient pump for a hybrid embryo. In the center of the web, suspended in a vat of murky fluid, was a creature. It was small, no bigger than a human child, but its body was a chaotic mess of scales, fur, and metallic grafts. It was alive, its heart beating in a slow, wet thrum that echoed through the room. "We have to kill it," Alara said, her voice shaking as she raised her plasma cutter. "We have to take the units and go." Lyraex walked toward the vat, her luminescence flaring until the entire room was washed in a brilliant, golden light. The creature in the vat opened its eyes, 3 pupils arranged in a triangle, and looked at her. "It's not a weapon," Lyraex said, her voice cracking with an ancient grief. "It's a sister, another failure, another ugly gift they left behind to rot." I looked at the filtration units. To take them, we would have to disconnect the life support for the creature. We would have to kill the only living soul in this graveyard to save the 500 back at the anvil. The math was simple. It was the same cold, logical calculation the consensus made every day. 1 life for 500, a monster for a colony. But as I looked at Lyraex, I saw the lesson I had been trying to teach her, and myself, being tested in the most brutal way possible. If we killed the creature, we were no better than the men who had built the anvil as a tomb. We were just another group of survivors trading a soul for a breath of air. "Kaelin?" Lyraex asked, her hand hovering over the biological web. "What do we do?" I looked at the creature in the vat, then at the dying light in Lyraex's eyes. I thought about the people back at the station, the mothers and the children, the scrap rats and the miners. I thought about the world I wanted to build, a world where the broken weren't just parts to be swapped out when the machine started to fail. "We don't kill it," I said, my voice sounding louder than I felt. "Boss?" Alara asked, her eyes wide. "We need those units. Everyone's gonna flatline if we don't get them back." "We take the units," I said, stepping toward the biological web. "But we take the creature too. We link the vat to the shuttle's secondary power loop. It's going to be a tight squeeze, and we're going to burn twice the fuel, but nobody gets left behind in the dark. Not today." Lyraex looked at me, and for the first time, the fury and the grief in her eyes were replaced by something else. It wasn't just hope. It was love. A fierce, protective love for the broken world we were trying to save. "Thank you, Kaelin," she whispered. We started to work, the sounds of our tools clashing with the slow, wet heartbeat of the bioforge. We were 3 broken souls in a plague ship, trying to save a monster and 500 refugees. And for the first time in 15 years, I didn't care about the odds. We were fixing what was broken, and that was enough. The journey back to the Iron Anvil was a descent into a mechanical fever dream. The rusty needle was screaming, its frame vibrating so violently that I thought the rivets would simply pop out and leave us naked in the void. We had the 2 massive filtration units lashed to the exterior hull with heavy-duty magnetic cables, and the biovat was wedged into the tiny cargo hold, glowing with a sickly violet light. "We're burning fuel at 70% above nominal, Jace," I shouted into the comms link, fighting the stick as a piece of debris the size of a ground car grazed our port thruster. "The weight is dragging us down. We're losing velocity. You've got to dump the vat, Kaelin." Jace's voice was barely audible over the static of the reach. "The Iron Anvil's gravity well is pulling you in too fast. If you don't shed that mass, you're going to be a smear of grease on the docking bay floor. I'm not dumping it." I roared, my missing fingers cramping around the controls. I looked back through the narrow hatch. Lyraex was huddled over the vat, her mechanical arm connected to the Bioforge's interface. She was acting as a living bridge, using her own energy to stabilize the creature's heart rate as the shuttle's power fluctuated. Her skin was the color of chalk, the golden light in her veins pulsing with an erratic, frantic rhythm. Lyraex, I yelled. You have to disconnect. You're burning out. The ghosts, Kalen, she rasped, her voice sounding like 1,000 whispers. They're so happy. They're finally going home. She didn't mean the creature. She meant the ledger. The thousands of digital souls trapped in her DNA were reacting to the presence of the bioembryo. They were feeding it, nurturing it, recognizing a piece of their own stolen humanity in the vat. We hit the atmosphere of the dead reach, a thin, toxic veil of gas and dust that surrounded the scrap belt. The rusty needle began to glow a dull, angry orange as the friction of the descent took hold. Brace for impact, I shouted. The docking bay of the iron anvil loomed ahead, a dark, gaping maw in the metal rock. I could see the lights of the emergency crews, the hundreds of people gathered behind the force fields, watching our descent. They were the ones who had been ready to trade Lyraex for a breath of air, but now they were the ones praying for our return. We came in too fast. The magnetic clamps tried to catch us, but the weight of the filtration units was too much. The cables snapped with a sound like a whip crack, and the shuttle skidded across the bay floor, sparks flying in a blinding cascade of white and gold. We slammed into the far bulkhead, the sound of crumpling metal deafening. For a long moment, there was only silence. The smell of burnt hydraulic fluid and ozone was overwhelming. I struggled out of the pilot's seat, my head spinning, blood dripping from a gash over my eye. Lyraex, I croaked. She was slumped over the vat, her luminescence faded to a dull gray. The creature inside was still pulsing with life, but its heart rate was slowing. I scrambled to the hatch, kicking it open. The emergency crews were already there, Ilara's mother among them, tears streaming down her grime-streaked face. Get the units, I shouted at the scrap rats. Get them to Sector 9 now. They didn't hesitate. They swarmed over the shuttle, detaching the filtration units and hauling them toward the secondary shafts. But as they worked, they saw the vat. They saw the creature. The murmurs started immediately. Is that a Vethvalar? What did he bring back? It's a monster. I stepped out of the shuttle, my mag wrench held tight in my hand. I looked at the crowd, at the people who were finally breathing the first clean air in 48 hours as the new units began to hum to life. It's not a monster, I roared, my voice breaking. It's a survivor, just like you, just like her. I gestured back to Lyraex, who was being carried out of the shuttle by Jace. She looked fragile, her mechanical arm hanging like a dead weight. She risked her life to bring this back, I said, my voice dropping to a low, fierce growl. She could have left it to die. She could have saved herself. But she chose to be better than the people who made her. She chose to be human. The crowd went silent. They looked at Lyraex, then at the creature in the vat, which was now being carefully moved to the med ward. The resentment, the fear, the cold logic of the past few days seemed to evaporate in the face of her sacrifice. She's one of us, Marcus, the former miner said softly. He stepped forward and placed a hand on the side of the vat. If the girl says it stays, it stays. I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. The humanistic theme wasn't just a theory anymore. It was the reality of the station. We had chosen the soul over the survival, and in doing so, we had found a way to survive together. But the transformation wasn't finished. As Lyraex began to wake up in the med ward an hour later, the station's sensors began to scream again. This time, it wasn't a consensus cruiser or a Vethvalar interceptor. It's a wideband broadcast, Kalen, Jace said, his voice trembling. It's coming from the core systems, from every relay station in the galaxy. I looked at the monitor. The image of the ghost of Ethelgard was there, but it wasn't the plague ship we had just left. It was a high-resolution file from the Vethvalar archives, showing the Bioforge in full operation. And then the ledger appeared. The data burst we had sent out weeks ago hadn't just been news, it had been a seed. And now that seed was blooming into a full-scale revolution. On Terra, on Mars, on the fringe colonies, people were rising up. They were demanding the truth about the hybridization project. They were demanding justice for the victims. And they were calling for Lyraex. She sat up on the bed, her amethyst eyes wide as she watched the screens. "They know my name," she whispered. "They know your soul," I said, sitting beside her. She looked at her mechanical hand, then at me. "What happens now, Kaylin? The consensus won't let this stand. They'll come for us with everything they have." "Then we'll be ready," I said, taking her hand. "Because we aren't just a junk pile anymore. We're a beacon." I looked at the stars outside the viewport. They felt closer than ever, a billion points of light reflected in the amethyst depth of her eyes. We had spent 15 years hiding in the dark, but the light was finally catching up to us. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to be seen. I looked at Lyraex and I saw the girl who had been called an ugly gift, who had been treated like a weapon, who had been discarded by the universe. But as she smiled at me, her skin glowing with a new steady radiance, I knew that she was the most beautiful thing the galaxy had ever produced, because she was broken, and she was whole, and that was the greatest gift of all. The aftermath of our return from the ghost of Vanguard did not bring the quiet peace of a job well done. Instead, it brought the frantic, metallic heartbeat of a station preparing for its final breath. The two industrial filtration units were now screaming in Sector 9, their pristine chrome casings already layered with the grime of the iron anvil as they pumped life back into our starving lungs. But the air, while cleaner, was heavy with the static of 1,000 intercepted transmissions. The galaxy was no longer just watching, it was screaming. I stood on the command deck, watching the tactical display as two separate fleets, the silver and blue geometry of the consensus and the jagged bioluminescent thorns of the Veth Valar, began to converge at the edge of the dead reach. They had formed what the news feeds were calling the Symmetry Alliance. It was the first time in 60 years the two empires had stopped killing each other, and all it took was a broken engineer and a girl made of scars to make them friends. "Kaylin, they've reached the outer marker," Jace said, his voice a ghost of its former self. He hadn't slept in 48 hours, and the dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. 64 ships, 3 carriers. They've established a total blockade. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. They're calling it a sanitization protocol. I watched the red blips on the screen. They weren't moving in for the kill yet. They were waiting. They wanted to starve the hope out of us before they turned the station into a cloud of expanding plasma. "Where is Lyraex?" I asked. "She's in the nursery," Jace replied, his fingers tapping a weary rhythm on his console. "She hasn't left that little hybrid kid's side since we got back. She's naming her Kaylin. She calls the little thing Nova." I turned away from the screen, my boots clanking on the deck plates. The iron anvil felt different now. The desperate, hungry resentment that had nearly boiled over into a riot when I crushed Vane's storage drive had transformed into something else. It was a somber, terrifying resolve. The refugees weren't hiding anymore. They were sharpening pieces of scrap metal, recalibrating mining drones, and checking the seals on their environmental suits. I found Lyraex in the med ward, sitting on the floor next to the biovat. The creature from the Vanguard, Nova, was floating in the murky fluid, her 3 pupils tracking Lyraex's movements with a strange, ancient intelligence. Lyraex looked up as I entered, the golden light in her veins pulsing with a soft, steady radiance that seemed to push back the shadows of the room. "They're here, aren't they?" she asked. I sat down on a crate, the weight of 45 years of mistakes settling into my bones. "They're here. 64 ships. They've got the reach locked down tighter than a vacuum seal." She reached out and touched the glass of the vat. "I can feel them through the loom, Kaylin. Not just the ships. I can feel the intent behind them. They're afraid. For the first time in their history, the people at the top are looking down and realizing that the dust they've been stepping on has a voice." I looked at her, at the way the scars on her neck seemed to glow in the dim light. "I spent my whole life trying to fix things, Lyraex. I thought if I could just find the right parts, the right code, the right algorithm, I could make the world run smoothly. But I was wrong. The world isn't a machine. It's a garden that's been overgrown with weeds and iron. You can't fix it. You can only choose what you're willing to grow." She stood up, her mechanical arm whirring with a low melodic sound. Then we grow the truth, Kalen. What are you talking about? The ledger, she said, her amethyst eyes burning. It's not just a list of names and bioweapon codes. I realized it when I linked to the Ethelguard. The data packet contains the neural resonance of every soul they tried to erase. If I use the synaptic loom to broadcast that resonance, not as data, but as a feeling, everyone in the galaxy will feel what we feel. They won't just see the truth, they'll live it. That'll kill you, Lyraex, I said, my voice cracking. The throughput to hit every relay station in the sector. Your heart won't stand the strain. She walked over to me and took my three-fingered hand in hers. Her skin was warm, vibrant, and for the first time she didn't feel like a weapon. She felt like a woman who had finally found her own gravity. We've been living in the dark for so long, Kalen. If I can turn the iron anvil into a star, even for a few minutes, isn't that worth it? Isn't that what you meant when you said you'd put the stars in my hands? I looked at our joined hands, the missing fingers, the silver filaments, the grease stains. I didn't want a martyr. I wanted a life. I wanted to wake up in 10 years and see her teaching hybrid kids how to weld. But I looked at her face, and I knew that the lesson I had been trying to teach her, that her value wasn't defined by her brokenness, had finally taken root. She wasn't doing this because she thought she was worthless. She was doing this because she knew she was the only one who could. I let out a long, shuddering breath. If we're going to do this, we do it right. I'll need to overclock the primary reactor and strip the shielding from the broadcast array. We'll be naked to their fire for at least 5 minutes while the signal builds. I can hold the station together, she said. I am the anvil now. I stood up, the lethargy and the fear vanishing, replaced by the cold, sharp focus of an engineer who finally understood the blueprints of his own soul. Jace, I shouted into the comms link, start the final sequence. Tell the people to get to the reinforced sectors. We're going to light a fire that the consensus won't be able to put out for 100 years. I walked toward the command deck, and for the first time, the people in the corridors didn't look away. Marcus, the former miner, stood up and gave me a sharp military nod. Alara checked the charge on her plasma cutter and winked. They knew the cost. They knew the math. And they were choosing to stay. As I reached the primary console, I looked at the tactical display one last time. The 64 ships were moving. The Symmetry Alliance had finally lost their patience. They were coming for their ugly gift, but they didn't know that the gift had already been opened, and the light inside was about to change everything. The iron anvil didn't feel like a station anymore. It felt like a living thing, breathing in rhythm with the girl who was currently plugged into its nervous system. Lyraex was suspended in the center of the synaptic loom, her body arched in a silent scream as the golden luminescence poured out of her skin and into the glowing fiber optics. The entire command deck was washed in a brilliance so intense it felt like standing on the surface of a sun. Kalen, the reactor is hitting 20,000%, Jace screamed over the roar of the mounting energy. The magnetic bottle is going to pop. Hold it, I roared, my hands flying across the keyboard as I manually bypassed the safety interlocks. Just 10 more seconds. Outside the viewport, the void of the reach had vanished, replaced by a wall of approaching fire. The 64 ships of the Symmetry Alliance had opened up with everything they had. Kinetic slugs, ion beams, and plasma torpedoes slammed into the scrapyard shield. But the shield wasn't just gold anymore. It was a shimmering, iridescent curtain of pure thought, woven together by the ghosts in the ledger and the will of a girl who refused to be broken. I could see the shells flattening against the energy field, turning into beautiful, harmless sparks. It was a symphony of failed destruction. Now, Lyraex, I shouted. She opened her eyes, and they weren't amethyst anymore. They were white, burning with the light of 1 billion stars. She reached out with both hands, and a sound like a great bell being struck echoed through every hull plate of the iron anvil. The great resonance began. It wasn't a broadcast of data. It was an emotional tsunami. I felt it first, a crushing wave of grief, followed by the sharp metallic tang of fear, then a sudden, soaring sense of belonging. It was the memory of a mother's touch on Ganymede, the feeling of a first breath of clean air, the defiant joy of a child learning to walk on metal legs. It was the ledger, translated into the universal language of the heart. I saw the 64 ships stop, literally stop. Their weapons went silent. Their engines flickered. On every bridge, on every colony world, on every screen in the core, the people of the galaxy were feeling what we felt. They were seeing Lyraex not as a monster, but as a mirror. The light held for 3 minutes. Then, with a soft, fading hum, it began to dim. Lyraex collapsed from the loom, her body falling toward the deck. I caught her before she hit the floor, my missing fingers gripping her shoulders as I pulled her into my lap. She was cold, her skin pale, and the golden light was gone, replaced by a soft, natural warmth. Did they feel it? She whispered, her voice barely a rasp. I looked at the tactical display. The Symmetry Alliance fleet was turning away. They weren't jumping into warp. They were just drifting, their formations broken, their intent shattered. Behind them, the news feeds were erupting. The revolution wasn't a riot anymore. It was an awakening. They felt it, I said, tears blurring my vision. You put the stars in their hands, Lyraex. All of them. I looked around the command deck. Jace was staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. Ilara and the scrap rats were standing by the viewport, watching the retreat of the empires with a quiet, stunned awe. We were still on a junk pile. We were still covered in grease and rust. But we were no longer invisible. The weeks that followed were a blur of transformation. The iron anvil was no longer a secret. It became the sovereign city-state of the Mended. The consensus and the Veth-Valar, their political foundations crumbling under the weight of the Great Resonance, were forced to sign the Dead Reach Treaty, recognizing the independence of the hybrid colonies and the rights of every sentient being to their own genetic code. I stood in the center of the new agricultural sector, 5 months after the battle. It was a massive dome of reinforced glass, filled with earth that we had shipped in from the outer colonies. I was teaching a group of hybrid children how to graft a Terran apple tree onto a Veth-Valar oxygen fern. My hands were still stained with grease, but they were steady. "Kaelin," Lyraex called out. She was walking through the rows of green shoots, wearing a simple white tunic that showed the scars on her arms without shame. Her mechanical prosthetic had been rebuilt with fine-tuned sensors and polished silver plating, but she used it to carry a basket of seedlings, not a weapon. Nova, the hybrid child, was toddling along beside her, her 3 pupils bright with curiosity. "The new filtration units for Sector 12 just arrived," Lyraex said, smiling. "Jace says he needs the master gearhead to look at the primary couplings." I laughed, a sound that no longer felt foreign to my throat. "Tell Jace I'll be there in an hour. These apples won't grow themselves." She reached out and took my hand, the one with the missing fingers. She didn't look at what was gone. She looked at what we were holding together. I stood there for a moment, looking up through the glass at the stars. They didn't feel like cold, distant points of light anymore. They felt like witnesses. I thought back to the man I was 15 years ago, a ghost hiding in a pile of junk, convinced that the universe was just a machine that had run out of oil. I thought about the box that had arrived in my docking bay and the ugliest gift that had turned out to be my salvation. I realized then that I hadn't spent my life fixing machines. I had been preparing to tend to this, to the messy, beautiful, broken reality of being alive. I had lost fingers and family and years to the dark, but in the end, the holes in my life were the only things that had allowed the light to get in. We weren't perfect, and the galaxy was still a complicated, dangerous place, but for the first time, we weren't trying to hide the cracks. We were using them to show where the light was coming from. I turned to the group of children who were waiting for me to show them the next step. I looked at Lyraex, my partner in the middle of this beautiful ruin, and I knew that we were exactly where we were supposed to be. Not heroes, not martyrs, but mended. I spent 45 years believing that my scars were the tally of my failures, that every missing piece of my hand or my history was a debt I could never repay. I hid on this station because I thought that if the world couldn't see me, it couldn't hurt me anymore. But I was wrong. I wasn't hiding from the world. I was hiding from the truth that even a broken engine can still find its way to the stars if someone is brave enough to take the helm. I used to look at Lyraex and see a project to be finished, a wound to be closed. Now I look at her and I see that the scars are just the roadmap of how we survived. We are all of us a collection of shattered things trying to hold each other together in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, the beauty isn't in the wholeness we strive for, but in the grace with which we carry our fragments. I look at my hands now and I don't see what's missing. I see what I am finally able to hold because I stopped clenching my fists in fear. I wonder as I stand here among these growing things, have you ever looked at the parts of yourself you try to hide? The scars, the failures, the things you think make you ugly, and realize they are actually the only parts of you that are truly yours? What would happen if you stopped trying to fix the cracks and started letting the light shine through them instead? I picked up my welding torch, the blue flame flickering with a steady, hopeful warmth, and began to teach the children how to build a world that wouldn't break. The amethyst stars and the golden girl watched over us, and for the first time, the void was silent.